Hello and good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Foreign Policy Forum, the organizer of this debate tonight, which, as you know, is on the 30th anniversary of the collapsing of Yugoslavia, the 30 years after Yugoslavia, and most specifically on the issues of unresolved issues in Western Balkans, so on the topic of unresolved issues in Western Balkans. First of all, I would like to welcome you all and thank you very much for taking part and for joining us. And in particular, I would like to welcome our three today's speakers, Professor Othon Anastasakis, Director of Southeast European Studies at Oxford and Senior Research Fellow of St. Antony's College. Mostly welcome. I think he's addressing us from London. Then Professor Neven Andjelić, who is from Regent University, London, and University of Bologna and Saarland University, teaches international relations and has been attending several of our previous meetings and being active in some of them as well. So welcome, Neven, also from London. And here is also Dr. Merdžanović, who is in Zurich and is a lecturer and senior researcher at Zurich University of Applied Sciences and a former junior research fellow at SEESOX at St. Antony's College, Oxford. One of the reasons why we wanted basically to invite these speakers and to give them floor is in the fact that they actually, in 2020, they published a book, an edited volume, which was a result of a conference back in
Recording in progress.
In 2018, which has a title, The Legacy of Yugoslavia. And in fact, it's dealing with political, economic, and social aspects of this legacy and within the context of the modern Balkans. And for those of you who haven't had a chance actually to see the book, it has nice chapters organized in 3 parts, and I'm sure Othon, exactly, it's there. Othon and Adis, who are 2 of the 4 editors of the book, jointly with David Madden and Adam Bennett, who I'm sure will say something about that. In addition to that, Neven also has a new book, which is with even more contemporary, I think, topic, which is COVID and international relations, with particular focus in the Western Balkans. So congratulations to all 3 of our participants for such a wonderful actually production of relevant and important work. Well, I mean, the other motive for today's debate, which is organized with the support of the Public Diplomacy Fund, which the Foreign Policy Forum has received from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the British Embassy in Zagreb, is that in 2021, we had several events focused on the issue of 30th anniversary of the collapsing of Yugoslavia. And I'm sure in the next 3 or 4 years, up until 1995 at least, we will have this 30th anniversary of various other events related to the collapsing of Yugoslavia. And what really came out of all this is a question of, where are we now, 30 years after the breakup of Yugoslavia? And then there were many comparisons with, let's say, 1975 in Europe after the Second World War. And in some cases, quite interesting ones. So for example, we had Osimo Agreement of 1975, 30 years after that war. Finally, we witnessed some kind of a resolution of the border issue between the former, enemies of Yugoslavia and Italy during the Second World War. Nevertheless, what really was slightly worrying in all these debates that we had is that a large number of people believe in post-Yugoslav states that the conflicts of the 1990s have not yet been resolved or not successfully resolved. I mean, if we look, for example, public opinion polls in Serbia published in 2013, there are 80% of respondents who say that these conflicts have actually not yet been fully resolved, that there is still a tail, if not the legacy of the 1990s, very much alive and influencing the bilateral relations, but also multilateral relations within the Western Balkans. And 60% in Croatia, after all. So we had a debate earlier, organized also by Foreign Policy Forum, on normalization of relationship between Serbia and Croatia on the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Agreement on Normalization in 1996. And also we identified several outstanding remaining issues, such as the missing persons, the issue of succession, refugee return, citizenship rights, property issues, but also borders between the two countries. Now, if we move on to Serbia-Kosovo issue, we see also the issue of recognition, but also the idea of frozen conflict. In North Macedonia, we resolved some issues with Prespa agreement, but is this now finished with regard to, for example, other identity issues being posed by some other states nearby? And I think more than this, there is still a continuity of ethnopolitics and the ideas of ethnic integration that go beyond the existing borders and maybe relativizing and questioning them too. And finally, at the end, just to mention some of these issues that I hope we will discuss just in a moment here, first through introductory speeches and then later on in an open floor for questions and answers session. There is also an issue of external guarantees for the peace and stability in Western Balkans. Are they permanent? Are they firm and solid, or not really? Now, I think this is enough really just to map, and maybe more than enough just to map the scope of a debate for today. And so without further ado, really, I would like to ask the same question to all three of our speakers. And that is, how did the legacy of Yugoslavia and of the conflicts that followed, how did it have affected contemporary development in terms of continuities and ruptures with the past? So I will invite first Dr. Anastasakis. Othon, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dayan, and thank you also for providing us the opportunity to speak about these issues, also to present some of the ideas in the book, go beyond that. And I have to say here that it's a pleasure to work with you. We've been in joint projects in the past and continue to do so. So I'm really, really pleased that I'm here today to converse with the other panelists and the attendees. And responding to the question of the title, like 30 years after the start of the disintegration of Yugoslavia, what remains unresolved is actually an impossible question. This refers obviously with how we understand that the past weighs on the present, how we assess and remember our past. These 30 years that have gone by since the start of this violent disintegration. And it depends also on who do we ask the question to, on what basis we ask to respond whether something is resolved, and what is the starting point that brought about the problem in the first place, which is still unsolved. So as I start, the question of looking back in time is a generational question. There is a generation with a memory of what Yugoslavia was, and then the generation that was born after the 1991 that does not have a memory of that Yugoslavia and what it was like. And these are two different perspectives, which make comparison very difficult to have. Then it depends on who is asked the question. The legacies, the accomplishments, and the failures are in the eye of the beholder. Yugoslavia and the subsequent wars were understood differently by the different ethnic groups, republics, provinces, localities. And related to that, on what basis and for what reason something is complete, incomplete, finished or unfinished, better or worse. If we ask Slovenes, for instance, they will probably say that they are much better off than what they were then. Most Croats would also similarly say the same thing. If we ask the Serbs, then the answer might be a little bit more ambivalent. If we ask the Kosovars, they will say that they're much better off because they're independent from the Serbs. And then if we ask the Serbs, they are worse off in terms of Kosovo not being a very clear part of their land. Then the question, what is the state of play today, 30 years after the start of the disintegration of Yugoslavia? It's also confusing how we define the starting point. Are we talking of the period before Yugoslavia, before the breakup of Yugoslavia, or the period after? The pre-1989 times or the post-1989 times? And the pre-1989 times are divided themselves among the Tito period of stable authority, but also the post-Tito period of the 1980s, when the Yugoslav environment was starting to disintegrate politically and economically. And as for the post-Yugoslav times, we have a lost decade of wars and economic devastation of the 1990s, and then a period of EU-led post-conflict transition. So to go back to the question, what has been completed and what has not, is a question which, according to which starting point and compared to what and who is responding. So this is the part where I start talking about our book with Avis and David Madden and Adam Bennett, including our additional contributors. One of them is here with us, Ljubica. And the title is about the legacy of Yugoslavia, politics, economy, and society, which actually is a paperback edition now. I'm very happy to say that because the book is much cheaper at £26 and can be more accessible. So this book was part of a project at SEESOX in Oxford, where we were discussing the legacies of history in terms of continuities or ruptures, using as our motto, Faulkner's line, the past is never dead, it's not even past. Our first book was on the legacies of World War I, where one of the major historians that you all know very well there in Croatia, Ivo Banjac, argued in his chapter in our book that the national projects which originated from World War I, the Serbian, the Croatian, the Macedonian, the Albanian, were not solved, but continued to exist 100 years after the war. But let me talk a bit about our book on Yugoslavia, because our motto for that book was that the breakdown of Yugoslavia and the independence of the new state was not the year zero, as some of the national elites in those states would like to claim. There were obvious ruptures with the Yugoslav past, but there were some significant continuities as well. We therefore embarked on looking at particular aspects to see mostly what had remained and directly linked from the Western Balkans with the Yugoslav past. We discussed liberalism in Yugoslavia and the communism and how this evolved into the post-Yugoslav political liberalism and economic neoliberalism under EU guidance. Avis will speak much more to this because he also wrote this chapter. We also looked for continuities in society and how the Yugoslav critical society under communism developed in terms of independence from the state or the political elites during the post-communist times. We discussed culture and whether such a thing as Yugoslav nostalgia exists in music, film, or other cultural events. In a foreign policy context, in a section in the book, we looked into continuities in the foreign policy field with the legacy of non-alignment. Indeed, this is not totally extinct, but mostly irrelevant in the current day and age, but differently appropriated, which also sometimes appears or reappears rather in cryptic ways in the neo-Titoist approach of some of the present leaders, most prominently in Serbia, in trying to keep a fine, often impossible balance between the different external players today. In my individual chapter in this book, I looked into the role of what we call today external actors, Russia and Turkey, and their impact and influence in the Balkans, but also how the local elites, as independent agents as well, instrumentalize their relations with these foreign actors. We can discuss that much more afterwards in the question and answer. In that book, we also saw the significance of borders, what they were before during the Yugoslav times, and what they were afterwards, especially in the context of the EU, where they were supposed to disappear, but they became much harder. And in the third section, to finish with the book, we discussed the legacy of the economy and the economic transition. And this is where we mostly looked at the legacies of the 1980s, the difficult economic times, but also what happened to the Yugoslav economic model Was it lost in transition? And as we see from the outcome, the being progressed at variable speeds among the new independent post-Yugoslav states, reflecting to a large degree also the economic discrepancies of the Yugoslav times. These are some observations if we look into the Yugoslav past as a point of departure. We concluded that by looking at the present from the prism of the Yugoslav past, that despite the ruptures in so many different areas, there are some obvious continuities as survival from the previous times, like behavioral or structural trends inherited from these times, but which continue to exist, but also other continuities, maybe as replications or imitations, as in the foreign policy actions, for instance, that we spoke about, or even some reinventions of the past in reworking various regional initiatives, for instance, the Open Balkans, in order to build some of the bridges and the free movement that existed before the breakup of Yugoslavia. The second part of this brief presentation that I'm giving now looks into the 1990s as a starting point to discuss what the open questions are from the period of the end of history. And indeed, the start of the disintegration of Yugoslavia undoubtedly opened many projects, which are still open-ending today and uncertain, with a double legacy of conflict and transition. Many will argue that on both counts, things are still unresolved. In conflict terms, there are the obvious open questions from the past conflicts in Kosovo and Bosnia in particular, but also in terms of transition. Many feel that in the Western Balkans, they live in a state of a permanent transition, or transitocracy as they call it. But this to me is only if one espouses the unilaterality and determinism of the process that is leading to an end goal, which as we know is not the case. My assessment on the open-ended matter is the following in very generic ways, irrespective of starting point or different points of views. First, ethnic problems are still with us, and some national projects are very much open. One only has to compare, obviously, what the parallel situation between Czechia and Slovakia is in order to notice the difference and realize Ivo Banac's argument. We may witness as most important problems the sustainability of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the normalization between Serbia and Kosovo. And these are not just problems of ethnic competition, but there are also still other actors who believe that some type of ethnic tidying up in terms of borders should be exercised in both of these places. Beyond ethnic open questions, there are different forms of what belongs to whom and different forms of self-righteous interventions into the religious, political, and other spheres between neighboring states. One example is the relationships between religious churches, for instance, and differences not only between different faiths, but also within the same faith and its different denominations. We know that example we've got from Serbia and Montenegro, and how the Orthodox Church of Serbia relates to and not acknowledging, obviously, the autonomy and independence of the Church of Montenegro. The second feature is not just the open-ended question of the EU accession, but also the irony that while Yugoslavia was a frontline state for EU accession and way ahead of the other Central and East European states with advanced association agreements with the European communities back then, most of it is still outside the EU. And it's not even certain that this is going to happen at all. We tend to see this as an unfinished business in the sense that it needs to be completed, the region being surrounded by EU countries, but it's not clear whether the EU really wants to include Serbia and Kosovo with the problem, Albania with its perceived corruption, Bosnia as the divided state, but also whether the political elites in the Western Balkan states really want to bring their countries in the European Union, and what that really entails for the sustainability and durability of their authority. Lately, we see that people are becoming cold feet also about the long delays of the process of many citizens in these countries. I believe that it would be a pertinent question actually to study the counterfactual, asking whether Yugoslavia might have been a different place had an accession process started with the European communities back then in the late 80s. The third area, the third characteristic of openness is the multiplication of borders in a territory where these actually did not exist. The raising of borders not only referring to new national borders of the new states, but EU borders as well. Hard borders between Croatia and the Western Balkans, softer between the Croat citizens of Bosnia and the EU. Language barriers, rather technical, although we are still speaking of the same language, religious barriers or economic borders, as well as borders within borders as a result of previous wars, the ethnic enclaves, for instance, in the case of Kosovo. And the fourth open-endedness is, and the outcome of the 1990s, is the revisionism of external powers, which, while they held back from Yugoslavia during the Cold War years, they have come back to claim hegemonic positions, to push for influence, to create clientele among the local communities in the region. We're all aware that by now, Russia, Turkey, and China are all claiming a post-imperial status in the Western Balkans, benefiting from the uncertainties of the space, and pursuing various forms of dependencies and clientelism, even some type of colonization, as we're seeing in the energy sphere in Russia, obviously a big economic influence in China, or a cultural influence coming from Turkey. The role of external players is this additional uncertainty as to what kind of new competition this can create and how these actors can use this space as a proxy for their competition with the West. I've very recently wrote a policy brief for the Atlantic Council of Montenegro on the parallels between Ukraine and the impact of the Ukraine conflict on the Western Balkans. So finally, the question at the end of the day is not whether issues are resolved or not, but whether this hybrid reality in the Western Balkans, with its achievements on the one hand and failures on the other, is the new normal or is the way forward. How and whether elites are comfortable with the present uncertainty and which are the areas that they would like to see progressing. We have seen how long conflicts become normalized, like the Cyprus division, countless decades now, or how relations between states also may follow cyclical modes between periods of improved relations and periods of worse relations, like we've seen in the Greek-Turkish context. But we have also seen some issues that can be resolved with the Macedonian name dispute, for instance, from which I believe that we can learn some positive lessons there for the future on how that was achieved. So I'm ending on this positive note, Dagan, and then we can have a further discussion.
Thank you so much, Othon, for this wonderful, actually, listing and reminding us, actually, of the outstanding problems. I mean, Adis Merdžanović wrote in this book that he also co-edited a chapter on liberalism in Yugoslavia before and after the disintegration. And quite interestingly, actually, in year 2018 and 19, there was a lot of discussion about this illiberal democracy in Eastern Europe and to some degree also in Western Balkans. I mean, work by Vera Strojarova and Damir Kapičić and Goran Čular and so on and so forth has in the meantime also been published. So this is obviously an interesting topic. And Othon mentioned transitology and transitocracy somehow, right? One of the key issues of this transition was a political transition to multi-party systems. Yet, 30 years after 1991, we see countries where there are leaders for 30 years in power, the same people. We also see countries where there is a one-party parliament de facto, right? And we see countries where there are no elections for about, in some parts of the country, in Mostar, for example, there used to be no elections for a very long period of time. So, what can we actually say about the liberal democracy 30 years after 1991, Adis?
Well, thank you very much, Dejan, and thank you for that question. And thank you also for giving us a platform here to speak a bit about the book, but also about all these unresolved issues 30 years after the disintegration and the emergence of these new states. I have to start with a little caveat to what I'm about to present, because about 2 years ago, I moved away from Western Balkans research. So it's not my daily business any longer. And I did so out of a certain frustration after having done Western Balkans research for about 10 years, starting with my master's and then through the doctorate and the postdoctorate, because there was one particular catalyst for that decision. And that catalyst was that when I came to Oxford in 2015, one of our brilliant colleagues, Jessie Barton-Horashova, she actually put together an open letter to Federica Mogherini at the time and John Kerry about the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and particularly what needs to be done, what is at stake, and so on. And this was 2015. And I think everybody who works on that issue signed the letter, we sent it off. Of course, nothing happened. And then in 2018, there was a second wave of a similar attempt being made, about putting the external actors that Othon also mentioned on notice with respect to Bosnia and the developments there, and so on, also including the solutions that need to be taken, you know, name the spoilers, punish them, sanction them, and so on, all these familiar sites. And somehow, for me, it showed the hypocrisy of the whole systematic approach that we have had with respect to the region. I mean, it is not, I mean, everybody who says we don't know what the issues are is lying. Everybody who says we don't know how these issues could be addressed, at least on some level, is equally not telling you the truth. So we know what the solutions are. We also know what the problems are, or we know at least where the solutions might start. But yet nothing happens. And we are repeating these continuous debates that we have there. And that's something that I think is the biggest unresolved issue of all, not disrespecting any of the other things that Othon has mentioned that you have mentioned in the beginning, Dejan. But I think this we really need to address these larger issues about what kind of engagement, what kind of philosophy we want to put forward when dealing with the region. And this includes the areas of honesty, the areas of transparency of process, the areas of EU integration, where something we have seen with particularly the negative results of with respect of President Macron's internal problems that somehow derailed EU integration for the time to come. So in that sense, I was a bit frustrated and moved away. And so for tonight, I would like to take a bit of broader scope and not talk about the unresolved issues like border issues and differences between certain countries or so, but I would like to talk a bit about the general framework. And I have to start with what you asked me about liberalism, the idea of liberal democracy in the Western Balkans. When we talk about the region, we usually talk about this framing from communism to democracy, or from socialism to liberal democracy, to be more precise, and so on. But that presumes this dichotomy that before everything was wrong, non-European, bad, and afterwards everything is in this glorious kingdom of liberal democracy. Everybody is fine and dandy, and everything goes right, which, as we all know, is not the case. But this is how the argument is presented to us in most of those debates. So what I would like to argue here tonight is that the most important unresolved issues have to do with our understanding and with the question why the establishment of liberal democracy did not yield the results we would have liked it to yield. That's the first question. The second question is what the way forward is, and here I will be speaking a bit about the rule of law, because I think that's the most important unresolved issue that needs to be resolved as soon as possible. As we all know, Yugoslavia was a particular kind of socialist system. I would argue that Yugoslavia's political, economic, and social system allowed for different degrees of citizen involvement, which is kind of the kernel of a liberal idea. It is not the liberal idea itself, but it's a kernel of it. It allowed for different degrees of citizen involvement, which created a rather powerful perception of a somewhat liberal society for large parts of the population itself. Regardless, of course, I'm not saying that Yugoslavia was a liberal system or anything like that, but I'm saying that they had liberal elements within it. And these liberal elements in the political, they start with 1948, they break with Stalin and the establishment of a new system, which was of course not Western, but it was also quite distinctly different to Stalinism that was before. We all know the buzzwords, brotherhood and unity as the first pillar. The second pillar was worker self-management, and the third pillar then the non-aligned movement. I mean, the entire system rested on these three pillars. And while ideologically the communist leadership was actually quite at the forefront of the legitimacy debate within the former Yugoslavia, or within Yugoslavia rather, they, in different times, in different periods of Yugoslavia's existence, as Neven Andjelić calls it, there was a mixture of oppression and cooperation with dissidents, with people expressing different ideas, going even as far as to criticize the elite and not being thrown in jail right away, depending on in which period they formulated their critics. And also the system of brotherhood and unity on the one side, but also of this federalism with the different republics, created a certain kind of pluralism within a communist structure, but it was a plural structure. So we had certain elements. Then in the social and economic spheres, the system of worker self-management was a third way between the capitalist, the neoliberal, liberal way of organizing the economy and this communism planned economy. If you speak to liberal liberal economists, as we have also chapters in the book on that, they will tell you the problem was the lack of ownership, which led to a lack of motivation to further these enterprises, which gave way to mismanagement, all the way leading up to the agro-commerce scandal and all these kinds of issues. So that's one way. But if you look at it on a different level, what socialism or communism tries to do is to politicize the economic relationships in a society. You know, when Marx spoke about the control of the means of production, that's what he meant. You know, political power should be based on the economic realities that we see and on those people who create the worth of things. But what we had in Yugoslavia was not so much the economization of the political, but the politicization. It was not so much the politicization of the economical, but the economization of the political. Meaning that the foundation of Yugoslav legitimacy was a social cohesion, and that was created by a system of social welfare system on the one hand, and of a marginal economic input, like citizen involvement through the economic system in those enterprises, which was a backbone of the legitimacy of the pre-1990 system. So it was not based on political rights and privileges, not on this liberal idea. And now what happens? The transition comes, you put forward these democratic elections, you introduce political liberalism into this mix that was all there. The Copenhagen criteria are defined: liberal democracy, market economies, market competitiveness, which is still one of the important Copenhagen criteria, and also one size fits all approach for the Eastern countries and for the Yugoslav successor states, despite the fact that the SAP process had some distinctions for the former Yugoslav region, but overall, it was something that was pushed forward with a political liberalism and an economic liberalism in mind, but not with a social liberalism, which was one of the big foundations of the previous system. So what happens? you bring in democracy, political liberalism leads to war. Parties that are elected, become elected, they start a war. So the appeal of this democratic pluralism has to appear at least questionable from this perspective. We saw what democracy brought about. Then, of course, this is notwithstanding that the entire political party system had actually was actually evolved, let's say, evolved out of this nationalist mindset that Othon has also spoken about. Then economic liberalism. We had botched privatization processes in the 1990s in all states of the of former Yugoslavia, and this is actually in the process. The people were robbed of the only outlet where they had something to say. So this does not appeal either from that perspective. And the last thing, social liberalism. I mean, what happened was a fragmentation of socialized care, a politicization of the entire social security systems, a politicization of the entire state system, state administrations, where basically you end up with clientelist networks of the parties in power. I mean, Florian Bieber once coined this wonderful phrase about Bosnia, that parties in Bosnia work like employment agencies. I mean, you support the party because you want a job rather than because you support the ideology of the party. So I think this is one of the things why this liberal democratic model didn't really take hold, because it was derailed on so many fronts, because it was applied to a situation where nobody actually analyzed what we had there before, and then put forward a solution that would fit. And this leads me quite neatly to the last point, the rule of law. Because if we say, okay, what should we do next? Then we need to look at the rule of law. And here again, the rule of law, as it is portrayed in the Western Balkans, or at least in these international papers on the Western Balkans or on the former Yugoslav region, is always linked to the European Union. The European Union wants us to fight corruption. The European Union wants us to introduce, to reform the judicial system, and so on. And this is an argument that frankly cannot stand on its own merit, because if you want to have sustainable reforms, you need to convince the people to support the reforms for their own sake, not for the sake of joining the European Union, something which is far, far off. I mean, I remember at SEESOX, we had the governor of the National Bank of Albania as a guest, and he told us that if Albania were to implement all the reforms the EU demanded of it today, it will need 50 years until it reaches the level of development that the European Union has today. And if you are a 25-year-old in one of those states, do you wait for 50 years in the knowledge that it might take probably 100 for these reforms to be implemented? Or do you simply say, okay, I'll seek my luck anywhere else? And this is somewhere else. And this is what we see in those regions. And this has to do because the idea of this rule of law framework about the laws and then the European Union wanting these debates and so on is what we would call a superficial understanding of the rule of law. What we really need is what my colleague Calypso Nikolaidis and I have called in a recent book a deep concept of the rule of law. The rule of law as the ordering principle of society. Something we should today in today's society, if the rule of law should stand a chance, we should be as offended about transgressions of the rule of law as we are sometimes about transgressions of what we deem appropriate, political correct, or what have you. It should hurt us on a different level. And to make the rule of law, and I'm 14.5 minutes, so I'll stop here, but to make the rule of law really tangible, we need to have the norms of human rights on the one hand. We need to have the democratic process as the procedural component on the second hand, and we need to have the rule of law as something that delineates the borders of those two concepts. And I think if we go forward with the understanding of the rule of law, democracy, and human rights as one deep concept of the rule of law, that's a way forward for the region and for the Western Balkans in total.
Thank you so much, Adis. In particular, I think it's very useful to get reminded against this black and white picture and one size fits all and expectations which are sometimes formed out of the context, of the historical context. I think it's now time to hear Neven Andjelić. And when I introduced Neven, I mean, I said about his latest book, but I think for our today's debate, it's equally important, or maybe even more important, his work on the Socialist Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, that is Bosnia-Herzegovina in Yugoslavia. And now 30 years after Yugoslavia, you know, we are still confronted with dilemmas on, you know, constituent nations, their mutual relationship, rotating presidency again, 30 years after socialist Yugoslavism, but also the issue of recognition of various actors in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and also the issue of borders. So it appears that 30 years after Yugoslavia, there are still unresolved issues, so to say, when it comes to nations and nationalism and borders, if not other issues. And I remember, I mean, a year ago, we had a big debate at LSE on nationalism in the Western Balkans. And I suppose some of us argued that actually this nationalism now seems to be more consolidated than it used to be in this anarchic and chaotic 1990s. So I very much look forward to what Neven would say on some of these and other issues. Neven, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dejan. Thank you, everyone. Did I switch on the microphone? Yes, I did. I think. Okay, you can.
We can hear you. We can hear you properly. Yes.
So basically, what I wanted to mention or to remind people, in 2002, the Associated Press ran a story on a bar restaurant where guests could take drinks while standing in two countries at the same time. And I think, Dejan, you would be familiar with this. It's near Samobor, so on Slovenian-Croatian border. Yeah. And all serious media, the New York Times, CNN, they carried out this story. Even the tabloid media, The Sun, several years later, they carried out the story. But there is no such stories about the Barle region in southern Netherlands. So we can see the kind of two-way approach. One set of the agenda for the Western Europe, or another one for the South Slavs. And I'm sure that South Slavs contributed themselves to a great extent to such a perception. And therefore, I set out a plan to use certain concepts in order to determine and interpret the contested issues that are still present in post-Yugoslav nations. So I was looking into the narcissism of small differences. I mean, the concept that was developed in psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud, picked up in 90s and 2000s by Michael Ignatieff when trying to explain South Slavs and in particular issues in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the conflict. Tony Judd later on, and then moved on to the popular literature that Christopher Hitchens then spread the word about these issues. Civic and ethnic nationalism as perceived by Karl Deutsch. So we have on one side good civic Western nationalism, and on the other side it would be bad ethnic, he didn't say Eastern, but non-Western nationalism. And I think that we can fit somewhere in these definitions. Aggressive symbolisms, again, something that, for example, use of religion during both nation building and state building processes among the South Slav nations. Anthony Giddens, who said that eternal in religion is not religious beliefs themselves, but symbols of collective unity. So this search for collective unity is something that adds to the aggressiveness of symbolist approaches in relations with others in these newly created communities. Creation and recreation of national symbols that reflects the nationhood that Gabriela Elgenius described very well. And this all brings us to the nation branding processes that are very much present in the new or renewed nations. Campanellismo is the term that I borrowed from social theories attempts to explain rivalries in Italy. And South Slavs fit into this very well. Who has the bigger tower of the church, or who has better commercial broadcast on CNN? And here's a ridiculous story. For example, Croatia invested heavily to revive tourist industry with a series of commercials on CNN. And then the whole region invested into their own commercials to be broadcast on CNN, regardless whether they had a reason for this or not. And here comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina. At the time I worked for CNN, so it was relatively easy to approach people in marketing to find out how much money has been earned from this. Of course, I didn't find out that, but what I found out that although Bosnia and Herzegovina had a commercial that was put on YouTube as CNN's commercial for Bosnia, it was never broadcast on CNN. There was never agreement for this. So it was for internal purposes and just add to this notion of campanellismo. Then it all leads to the competing nationalisms. I would recall Michael Billig here and his idea of banal nationalism. And although he focused more on Western nations, but he did say that from positions of Washington, Paris, or London, it is Moldova, Bosnia, and Ukraine that seem peripheral. And unfortunately, we can see that the same three countries stay in under the attention of studies of borders, of nationalism, and contested issues. So what are the issues that are contested? I group them into territorial, spiritual, memorial, environmental, financial, and political. And territorial are somehow grabbing the attention, recognition of borders that have been mentioned by previous speakers already. And here is the irony that it is North Macedonia that is the only state with no border issues. Everything else is the issue with this state, from the very name, the flag, the language, but borders are somehow settled. Kosovo has issues, the issues of Kosovo could fall under kind of umbrella of existential. Does it exist or not? It depends on the point of view. It depends on the definition of a state, whether it's Montevideo Convention from 1933, whether it's Weber, whether it's Serbian nationalist that is defining the state, or Kosovo Albanian, or, well, we can go around the world for these issues. Serbia deploys policies of an ostrich, basically, when it comes to Kosovo, and Kosovo creates issues even when there is no need for this, as it was in relations with Montenegro for quite some time at its own expense. And we might even talk about the triangle, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, because Serbia and Montenegro shouldn't have territorial issues, but just the recognition of Kosovo by Montenegro created the issue. So it should be triangle, it should be bilateral relations between Serbia and Montenegro in such an interpretation. And that brings me everything to Bosnia and Herzegovina that has issues with all the neighbors. And I'll just look to the smallest one that is not supposed to have the issues, but it was raised by a politician from non-nationalist political party, ironically. The issue of Sutorin, a small area near the border with Croatia, near Herzegovina, that historically under the Karlovac Treaty at the end of 17th century, under the Berlin Congress, belonged to the Ottoman Empire or Austria-Hungary, i.e. Bosnia-Herzegovina, but did not belong to Bosnia-Herzegovina in socialist Yugoslavia. So request to reconsider the borders and seek exit to the sea over there is directly undermining the Badinter's Commission findings that inter-republics borders in Yugoslavia should be recognized as international borders. This is the basis for the recognition of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and under the condition where internally even the sovereignty and territorial integrity has been questioned, we have politicians that raised this issue. It wasn't adopted in the parliament, but it is part of the public debate among political community, Sarajevo-based political community, some parts of it, I would say. Croatia, well, the bridge, I mean, this is the point, uniting two pieces of Croatia, ignoring the fact that there are many countries in Europe that have exclaves or enclaves in their territory. And complaints coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina that it seriously undermines the ambition of Navy power of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The bridge would prevent huge plane carriers approaching the port of Neum or something like this. Moving on to spiritual, Orthodox Church, it has been mentioned already. The right to exist. Even during Yugoslavia, there was a question about Macedonian Orthodox Church, refusal to recognize it by Serbian Orthodox Church. More seriously, in post-Yugoslav nations, we have issue of Montenegrin Orthodox Church, issues of the right to exist, right to property, ownership over the faithful, and ultimately, it was the Serbian Orthodox Church that unified disparate group of political parties to finally, after 30 years, defeat the ruling political party in Montenegro for a year at least. Islamic community is having some similarities with this. Jurisdictions, do they correspond to state borders? Is it all right to have a Jemaat in Copenhagen or Malmö? Is it the same as having a Bosniaks Jemaat in Novi Pazar or Belgrade? The supreme jurisdiction, is it in Sarajevo or in Belgrade? Moving to memorial and the policy of victimization of nations is a kind of policy that could be found in all the post-Yugoslav countries. Shifting of the day of the beginning of the siege in Sarajevo is one issue that almost unnoticed goes around. All of a sudden, the beginning is commemorated as the 5th of April. Previously, it was 6th of April. Neither of the days historically is correct, but for the ruling elite, the 6th of April is connected with the liberation at the end of Second World War with partisans, basically. The real siege started several weeks later when the last train actually managed to come into the Sarajevo. Genocide legal cases before the International Court of Justice, Serbia versus Croatia and Croatia versus Serbia. The only people benefited from these cases were international lawyers who were very well paid for this. Glorification of war criminals, the issue ours and theirs, and something that is very much present among post-Yugoslav nations. During the pandemic, the commemoration for the victims at Bleiburg was organized in Sarajevo main cathedral. The mass was there, and it created absurd situation that it was organized from Croatia, not from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the absurd situation was that on the streets outside the cathedral were anti-nationalists together with Bosniak nationalists. Anti-nationalists protested against the commemoration to Second World War criminals, in addition to the civilian victims. And Bosniak nationalists protested because it was Croat nationalists who organized the commemoration. We have the issues of desecrating a partisan cemetery in Mostar. Vraca Memorial in Sarajevo is in disrepute for decades. Basically, everything connected with the Second World War. The victorious side during the Second World War is abandoned by the ruling elites everywhere, almost. And then nearby the Vraca Memorial in Sarajevo, there is a plaque to Ratko Mladić that only recently started to be, shall I say, attacked by some of the activists. Immediately they are notified and arrested by the local police force, whilst all other crimes go unnoticed by the very same police force. So I would add the Korana Bridge in Karlovac and naming it after the unit that in which served the sentenced war criminal for the crime committed on that very bridge is a part of this series of the examples. The bridge, Veliki Park in Sarajevo, Batajnica near Belgrade, and first of all, Srebrenica. They have all these crimes have been questioned for political purposes by members of the political elite and then picked up by ordinary public. And this is the situation that we have these contested memories to this day. Environmental issues all come under the possible title pollute the neighbor. That's the title for the policy. The radioactive waste storage plan for the facility near the border with Bosnia by Croatia. And then the triangle Trebinje, Dubrovnik, Herceg Novi. Water goes from Trebinje to Dubrovnik and then to Herceg Novi. And of course, it has been played for political purposes. The EU recognized the importance of cross-border collaboration by providing grant for firefighters, because fire doesn't stop at international borders, like environmental policies should not and cannot stop at international borders. Financial issues, Ljubljanska banka case that is that has affected most of the post-Yugoslavs, property issues, and that brings us to the political field, emotionally charged political conflicts. Despite the ideological fraternity, most of the leading political parties in post-Yugoslav states belong to the European People's Party. However, they quarrel at the former common area. And that creates foreign policy issues. This is, I'm approaching the end. I try to find the answer, who is the friendliest nation in the neighborhood? So for Croatia, arguably the best relations Croatia would have with Montenegro, despite the prolonged territorial dispute and the consequently maritime dispute. And we know the recent history of relations between Croatia and Montenegro. Serbia, probably on anecdotal evidence, with something that is perceived as traditional enemy, Bulgaria. Bosnia Herzegovina with Montenegro, but only if the ruling party is the party that has been there for 30 years. Otherwise, the relations are not good. Montenegro, I would think of Albania, similarity of the autocratic rule might be the cause. Slovenia, Hungary, ownership over the Slovenian media, similarity of the ambition of the prime ministers of both countries. And Macedonia has a choice whether to be South Serbia, Greater Bulgaria, Greek Macedonia, or fragmented by Albanians. The only easy answer is Kosovo. We know who would be the friendliest nation in this case. So these are the results of the unresolved issues 30 years since Yugoslavia. I'll end by referencing Richard Sakwa, who distinguished post-communist states in Europe into two groups. Those who were marked with 1989 as crucial year for changes and their future, and those that it was 1991 as a crucial year for their changes. The end of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the end of the Soviet Union marked the differences between these two groups of states. And the problem with Yugoslavia is that basically we ignored 1989 largely, and 1981 we were preoccupied with some other things and not with the fall of the Soviet Union. So that might be the reason, the causes for such a large set of issues.
Thank you, Neven. With this, we come to an end of this introductory speeches or remarks. And I would like now to invite for questions and comments from the audience. If anyone wants to raise a question or ask a question or make a comment, please just indicate it. The best way would be through raise hand, the small icon actually, if that's possible. If not, then raise your hands physically. I hope I'll see you, especially if you have your camera switched on, of course. Otherwise, might be difficult. Okay. Well, then I have one, but maybe this one could be answered towards the end. And then if anyone wants to raise a question before this, maybe that would be a good time now to do that now. I mean, the question that somehow occupies me in this year of the anniversary was, is this integration over? Can we say this process is now just historical, or is it still something that is ongoing? And then, of course, there is an issue of reintegration. And we see various ideas about reintegration. Of course, not in Yugoslavia. I don't think we have really anyone politically arguing for that. But for example, through Open Balkans, and alternatively through ethnic integration, as I said earlier, various forms of Serbian world or Albanian unity or Croat question in Bosnia, which fundamentally is the key Croatian question, not only Croat-Bosnian question. And of course, the issue of the integration into the European Union. So I don't know whether, I mean, that certainly is something that 30 years after 1991, we should probably try to address as well. But in the meantime, I'm sure there might be other questions if this one is too complicated or maybe out of the focus. Issue of disintegration, is it over or not? And then integrations. Okay, are there any further questions, or shall I just maybe ask our speakers maybe to reflect upon this one? Okay, so what do you think on this disintegration, integration issue? I don't know if anyone wants to start with this. Othon.
I can have a go at it, because I mean, if you ask this question, obviously, let's say 10, 15 years earlier, when the notions of integration and disintegration were much clearer to how we understand them, there could have been a much more straightforward answer, I suppose. I mean, back then, integration was, especially before the crisis, right? Integration into the European context was much more straightforward in a way. I mean, the Union had a kind of a sense of a purpose, but then obviously during the 2010s, the whole kind of understanding of these issues was totally upset. The other thing is that if you take this integration literally, it probably has stopped with Kosovo. But then, if we think that there is the danger of Republika Srpska again, or further divisions along different lines, that's something that hasn't ended. I mean, I was listening to Neven's very, very interesting presentation, and was thinking how whether all this that is happening that you've been explaining, Neven, is part of the conflict of the 1990s that actually complicated the picture very much for the region, or whether it was actually something that the Yugoslavia had, at the end of the day, reached such a high level of integration and convergence within its own different people, notwithstanding obviously the differences that existed during that time as well, that that task is something, it's actually something impossible. And if we think that the issue is resolved by the creation of nation states, and then we don't have any further problems, obviously we are deluded. The other thing is also that we are at a time when nationalism is back in the picture. I, for one, don't take the Western Balkan environment as so exceptional from the wider European environment. Obviously, there are the kind of the local disputes and disagreements that exist there. But at the same time, it's very much part of the wider European puzzle that also leads to those tendencies of disintegration of various levels. And obviously, talking from a British perspective as well, this is the epitome actually of disintegration of a country that left, but it won't recover anytime soon. So if we kind of want to look parallels in there, even in what could be considered as a more advanced kind of level of democracy and capitalism, the confusion that has been created from the disintegration happening between Britain and the United Kingdom and the European Union is something unprecedented. I live it every day of my life here in the UK. All those problems actually do emanate from this kind of decision, what we are seeing now. So, in a nutshell, I mean, that's a response, very confusing.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Dejan.
That's fine, thank you so much. We now have Vesna Pusic and Anna Lasica. Vesna.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your presentations. I wanted to ask you or see if you would care to comment on the more recent developments in our region. I mean, disintegration of Yugoslavia, yes, there are certainly there are some unfinished things, but in many ways, I would say that's true for almost any situation in any country in Europe. And some issues reemerge, etc. But in a way, I would say that the countries that were formed on the territory of former Yugoslavia are here. And for a long time, the common denominator in policies of these countries has been this aspiration to join the European Union. And that was in a way dictating the agenda of the reforms, or at least pretended reforms. But that was something that in a way everybody agreed on. Lately, I would say, it didn't happen lately, but it's sort of surfaced or resurfaced, that there are some other common denominators, maybe less agreeable. And one is a strong Russian presence and meddling in the affairs of the countries of the Western Balkans, Croatia and Slovenia included. I include all the countries of former Yugoslavia. And that has, Russia has used, I would argue, the Western Balkans not so much as an area where it wants to be present necessarily, or it wants to draw into its sphere of interest, which they're reviving now, but more as a sort of bargaining chip in their discussions with the European Union and with the Americans. And people like Dodik and people like the Democratic Front in Montenegro and a number of politicians in the region have been used as destabilizers that are, I would say, to a large extent, really used by Russia and Russian interests in the region. And that has become more unpleasant, but pretty much a common denominator nowadays. And this is not even an unfinished business. This is not even started business. We haven't even started articulating policies or ways of dealing with this problem, or understanding how deep it goes, how serious it is, to what extent will they actually try to interfere even more than they're doing now. So I would be interested if you would care to comment on that.
Right, thank you. Anyone in particular who would like to say something on this?
I could also, but if Neven wants to, I can speak later. I agree with Vesna that Russia wants to be a spoiler. And also, I need to say here and sort of predict, and I was always all along with this view, that there wasn't going to be a hot conflict in Ukraine, because that would actually bring Russia into a very difficult position in two ways. The first one, in that it would have to get involved into a very severe war that would have no end. The second, which is even more risky, is that then the countries, especially in the Western Balkans, where the divisions are clearer, they would have to take sides. Now, I was not surprised by the fact that Serbia and Vučić kept a very low profile in this, because they didn't want to take sides. It wasn't actually helping them to take any sides. But had there been an actual struggle and fight, then obviously all the Europeans will have to take sides. And it's very difficult for one or two actors in the region that are disagreeing with the rest to actually take the opposite sides of them. So it is risky for Russia. And what I believe is that the way that it helps Russia and how Russia is involved in the region is it's convenient to keep it at the slow burner, which in a way then helps Russia not to have the unity of the Europeans on issues of sanctions or other issues that have to do with the relationship with Russia. So it is convenient, low cost, no need to invest too much. You keep that kind of division at a certain level, and it actually is convenient for you. There are obviously some other countries in Europe as well that are much more flexible towards Russia, Italy, Greece, Bulgaria. But at the end of the day, if push comes to shove and they have to decide on a war situation, I think it will be very, very difficult for them to go the Russian side. So that's not very good news for Russia either.
Thank you, Neven. I think you wanted.
Yeah. As both Vesna and Othon said, what we have is that the Western Balkans is being used by Russia as a distraction area to distract the West from the real intentions and where they are really serious. And this is in their immediate neighborhood, in their post-Soviet space or in Eastern Europe. And some of the leaderships in post-Yugoslav states are basically trying to find their own use. It is also a question of the sincerity of the European Union, whether they really want to offer the expansion. It is pretty much clear that for quite some time there will be no further expansion of the European Union, but also the political elites in post-Yugoslav states. It would be catastrophe for them. They cannot simply rule the way they are ruling for 30 years now or 25 years in the same way, continuous way, if there were further steps towards European integration. And also even the Slovenia and Croatia, would they sincerely want other post-Yugoslav states to join them within the European Union? I think they're in a position like France. Does France want ordinary French voters that would have to approve further expansion of the European Union at referendum? Do they really want any additional members in this family? And even within this Western Balkans family, mini Schengen idea that was advocated, immediately it was refused by a set of political parties within Bosnia and Herzegovina because they saw it as a kind of artificial creation of Greater Serbia, Greater Albania, political spaces, not really political entities. So I would just compare this current situation, for example, also Montenegro taking loans from China, whilst the much cheaper loans are available at European Union, but there is a policy of conditionality coming with these loans. So they clearly opt for more expensive solutions because that would keep them in power. And this is the reality of political elites in the Balkans. So that clearly is non-liberal democracies being developed.
Thank you. We now have Anastasakis. You wanted to add something?
No, I can wait. Let's take a few more questions and then.
Right. Okay. Well, then Anastasakis, please.
Thank you very much for interesting presentations. My name is Anastasakis. I am a PhD student from Dubrovnik, interested in identities, secession, policies of national identities. So in order to contribute to this discussion, I prepared a comment about one issue which I wouldn't label as unresolved because of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, but rather as a new political issue between Croatia and Serbia produced 30 years after the war because of the creation of new states and new policies, and which will never be resolved because of the different premises between Croatian and Serbian philologists. So that's the question of Dubrovnik literature until 1867, which is stated in the Serbian law of cultural heritage as the one that belongs both to Serbia and to Croatia. It started as a philological issue, and recently when this law was brought in Serbia, it became a political issue as well. We could hear reactions of Croatian Ministry of Culture, Croatian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Serbian embassy in Croatia. We could hear the narratives which were produced in the war of the 90s and which are present today as well. For Croatia, Serbs are aggressors, invaders, attackers who now want to steal Dubrovnik literature. From Serbia, you could hear that the reaction of Croatian institutions was expected because Croatian state from its formation in the 90s is a successor of NDH, state that hates and discriminates Serbs, neglects the historical presence of Serbs and their cultural contribution on this territory. So what I want to point out that we never had these kind of discussions about Dubrovnik in Yugoslavia. Scientists both from Zagreb and Belgrade were coming to Dubrovnik to do the research. Serbian historians then were referring themselves to Jovan Skerlić, whose attitudes towards Dubrovnik literature from Renaissance and Baroque period was that it didn't have any impact on Serbian literature. On the other side, you could never hear then from Croatian historians that we should emphasize that the authors of these masterpieces, Držić and Gundulić, were Croats. We can hear that today from some political elites and intellectuals as well. So today's categories, policies, and narratives are being put in the period of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century on the territory which was a microstate, Dubrovnik Republic, from 1348 till 1808, and whose citizens, including the creators of these masterpieces, had just a political identity. Dubrovnik citizens had different kind of ethnic identities, but these identities weren't important at all in the period of Dubrovnik Republic. Dubrovčanin or Raguzian was a person who could satisfy two criteria, to be legally identified as a citizen of Dubrovnik and confessional rule identified as a Catholic. When you stopped being a Dubrovnik citizen legally, you immediately stopped being Raguzian or Dubrovčanin. So new political question is now present because of the contemporary policies of national identities in Serbia and in Croatia, competition between Serbia and Croatia in every field, history as well, who was historically and culturally more dominant over the other on the territory of the ex-Yugoslavia, and post-war tendency to nationally identify famous persons from history as Croats or Serbs in order to strengthen a national reputation. So I think that this political issue would have a quite negative outcome for the openness of Dubrovnik archives to everyone. Science is perceived as a political instrument, and it should be an autonomous field where you are allowed to make questions and debates about every issue. Researchers are not being perceived just as scientists who are interested about the history of Dubrovnik, but whether they have some hidden agenda. So that's not good, because after all, the best book about Dubrovnik history wasn't written by Croatian, either Serb, it was written by a British, Robin Harris. Thank you. This was just a comment.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. We now have Mark Pedersen. Mark, please, who is in New York, right?
Indeed, Dayan. Thank you. So I'm Mark Pedersen from the Department of Peace Operations at UN headquarters. Firstly, thank you, panel, for a very interesting discussion. I had a very brief question. I'm wondering how many of the unresolved issues have actually been exacerbated by the efforts of the international community, which primarily sought to end conflict in the Balkans in the 1990s rather than to create enduring political structures. And I wonder whether these efforts by the international community have actually created more space for bad actors to flourish rather than less space. Thank you.
Very interesting. Adis, would you like now to say something and also to refer to some of these questions here, please?
Yes, thank you very, very much. Let me start with the last question, which is a question very dear to my heart, because in my PhD, I argue that the entire political system of Bosnia could have worked were it not for certain actions of the international community that kind of changed the incentives for the local political elites. That's, of course, a much larger discussion here, but I think that there are important aspects in which these issues have been aggravated by external actors. And in one, I mean, we can list a number of issues where it worked. We can also where it had negative effects. We can also list a number of issues where it had positive effects. Just to name one, the central bank system in Bosnia, which was also made by a foreigner, an Australian, I think, at the time, who provided Bosnia with a rather stable and trustworthy currency to this day, with the peg to the Deutsche Mark and later to the euro. So there are pros and cons in this, but I think the most negative effect of international involvement was the fact, as you rightly mentioned, to perceive everything through the lens of conflict. Because if you perceive everything through the lens of conflict, then you're willing to accept certain solutions that violate certain norms, which in other areas you would not accept. And the best case to study here is the implementation attempts of the Sejdić-Finci verdict in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Obviously, the current political system of Bosnia is the result of a compromise during a war that neglects the human and political rights of national minorities. And during these discussions, which have been ongoing since the verdict was rendered some, I think, almost 2 decades ago now, it is that, okay, find a solution that works on paper. It doesn't have to work in reality. It can have different effects and so on. And the international community just puts forward these solutions, which are not really solutions, in the sense that either you want to establish a politically fair democratic system or you don't. And this limits, so the scope for compromise is somehow limited if you superimpose real norms, democratic values on it. And that's kind of a catch-22 situation. What do you want? The resolution or the norms that you might might have to wait for longer. Let me also ask. I really enjoyed Anna's contribution here, because it was an area which I'm not familiar with. But the pattern that we see is not that new to us. I mean, the fight over historical legacies, and just to name the most famous one, whether Nikola Tesla was a Serb or a Croat or what have you. I mean, all these, or we can say the same thing about Ivo Andrić, Bosnians, but whatever you want. So I mean, these issues are not new in that sense, but up to a certain point, I wonder whether we want too much. I mean, I live in Switzerland, and there are certain things in the German-speaking part of Switzerland that the Swiss Germans think is Swiss, whereas the Germans think they are German. The same thing happens in the French-speaking part with France. So maybe we are applying a certain norms here that can never be reached within a normal framework of international relations, and also, to use a properly British term, some friendly banter between neighboring states. So if we reach that level, I think we have done it. And I perceive this whole thing as Ernest Renan said, nationalism is a daily plebiscite. So every day we have to say, yes, we are Swiss, yes, we are German. Otherwise, if we stop doing it tomorrow, the state ceases to exist. And I think that's, so is this integration over? That the entire question is somehow framed in this, there is an end point, a natural end point where everything is in equilibrium. And I would question that teleological aspiration.
Okay, thank you so much. Are there any further questions or comments?
Can I add something to the international community question, Dayan?
Indeed.
Because I think that there is not such a concept as an international community. Maybe we came, close to this during the 1990s, but that was under the hegemony of the United States, and in the end, that was totally disagreeable to Russia. And often, I think we should be also a little bit self-critical in the Western world, that we did underestimate how also Russia, looked at the world. So we definitely not have an international community as such. And at the same time, even if we take the West, I agree with what Adi said, and obviously there are mistakes that one does during the conflict, also after the conflict, in the international administration that one sets up, and then, whether they exit or whether they remain. One of the big problems, I think, also from the Western community if that is the most united we can get in a way in defining an international community, is that even the Western community in the Western Balkans doesn't never speak with one voice. So, you know, I've talked to many people from the region, and they actually have a different voice from the United States and then different opinions from the European Union as well. That, I think, is a simple fact, and that actually exacerbates relations, definitely.
Thank you. Okay, I think it's time maybe to summarize the whole thing. I don't know if our speakers would like to say maybe a sentence or two at the end before we just like wrap up everything. I mean, Neven, would you?
Two sentences. Basically, it is on the international community. My argument is that leaderships during wartime in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they didn't have legitimacy. And they were given legitimacy when they struggled by the international community that invited them to numerous negotiations in Geneva, usually. Because in the beginning, it was only people who actually fought, who were sincerely defending their own homes, or a proper serious nationalists who prepared themselves for the forthcoming fight. Majority of the people were mobilized by force, really, by all sides that were in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, today, nobody would accept this, and everyone claims to be patriot, defending the state, the nation, depending on the interpretation. And I think with this, I would actually stop because we are running out of time.
Good. Okay, Adils.
Yeah, I mean, just one word actually of caution. I mean, we all think about this discussion about external actors, international community, and so on. Also, I understand this is the foreign policy forum, but I think we have reached a point where the solutions to those unresolved issues will not come from above. They will not come neither from the politicians, they will not come from the international community, and so on. They must, if they were to be sustainable, they must come from below. So in this sense, I think the way towards resolving all these issues that we have seen now lies in creating fora for citizen involvement within those foreign policy issues, and to localize these issues as far as possible. That would be my 2 cents. I mean, if I can go there. And just a little anecdote: 30 years, the Swiss archives opened, and in 1991, the Swiss government put in an application to join the European Union. In 92, the people voted by a majority of 50.2% not to join the European Common Market. And subsequently, Switzerland is now firmly outside of the European Union. So the people can change this high politics.
Yes, they usually make wrong decisions, as we see in 1991.
Well,
and
to each his own, you know.
Don't mix them up into the process. Yes. Okay. Othon, is there anything you would like to say for the end? Or?
Well, I would like to say that we also need to look, first of all, into the areas of change in the region. There are various, optimistic changes that we actually need to mention them, because by focusing only on the unresolved problems, then we are kind of continuing that really ethnicized discussion, that actually has to go beyond at some point. And I do believe that there is an air of change from some directions, and also much more. The voice of the region is very important, because even when I use the term Western Balkans, I honestly dislike it so much, because it's this kind of EU terminology to kind of put the area together that is outside the European, and then we start looking at the Western Balkans minus this and plus the other. So much more of the voice of the region, I think, is really much wider. And also thank you very, very much, Dayan, for giving us this opportunity for this debate.
Thank you so much once again. It was a great pleasure, and I'm particularly glad that we had a chance really to bring the three of you to closer, I think, to the audience here in the so-called Western Balkans, or Croatia plus Western Balkans, or whatever you want to call it, post-Yugoslav states or whatever, that I think is in itself a great benefit. And I look forward to our next event and to further cooperation with all of you. Thanks. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I can announce basically, but not yet the exact date, but certainly for a next event that we will organize in March that will be focused a little bit more on the British foreign policy, especially with a focus on the region of the Western Balkans, but we will keep you posted about this. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, pozdrav.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Bye.
See you, bye.